We're calling this webinar Getting Started. Everybody, I'd like to just say thank you so much for being here. This is going to be, everybody, I'd like to just say thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a wonderful interview with experts in supported decision making. We're calling this webinar Getting Started with Supported Decision Making. So we have three fantastic guests here who are going to answer our questions, who I will let them introduce themselves, but let me just let you know that Attorney Morgan Whitlash of the Center for Public Representation is here. We have Jonathan Gardner, who's making quite a name for himself. Everywhere I look about supported decision making, Jonathan is the speaker. So it's really excited to hear his wisdom and personal experiences with supported decision making. And then we have Nancy Gardner, who brings us insight about being an effective supporter as part of Jonathan's team of supporters. So Morgan, Jonathan, and Nancy, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time today. I'm going to start with Morgan and ask you if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started with supported decision making.
Thank you, Heather. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm currently the Director of Supported Decision Making Initiatives at the Center for Public Representation, or CPR, which is the National Legal Advocacy Center that is committed to protecting and advancing the rights of people with disabilities using legal strategies and systemic reform and policy initiatives. So we have offices in Massachusetts, New York, and Washington, D.C., and I'm based in the D.C. office. I first got involved with supported decision-making about 20 years ago when I worked at a federally funded protection advocacy organization as an attorney. Part of that work was to represent people with disabilities in guardianship proceedings and in accessing less restrictive options, including supported decision-making, although we didn't use that term at that time. Later, I was the long-term legal director of another organization in D.C. that advanced the rights of people with disabilities and was involved in some well-publicized cases around termination of guardianship in favor of supported decision-making. And I'm the former lead project director of the National Resource Center on Supported Decision-Making. I've published and contributed to numerous articles and national reports and done trainings like this one and webinars about the subject. I firmly believe that it's people with lived experience using supported decision-making that are the real experts here. So I just feel very fortunate to be joined today by Jonathan and Nancy.
Thank you. We're excited to have them as well. So Jonathan, I'm going to pass it over to you. Can you please tell us about yourself and how and when you got involved with supported decision-making?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Gardner. I'm a 20-year-old decision maker, self-advocate, and cancer survivor who happens to have autism. Since the age of 13, my vision has always been to help others in any way I can. I have many types of support and supporters that help me live my best life. A lot of people like me have a guardian. I don't. Instead, I use supported decision-making. Supported decision-making is an alternative to guardianship where the person, me, picks a group of people they trust to help them make decisions. I am the decision maker in my life. Let me explain how I got here. When I was 16 and in school, my mother and I were told that I needed full guardianship. This didn't feel right for us. My mom had learned about supported decision making, and we decided to try it in my life. To me, supported decision making is just another tool that I have in my toolbox. Supported decision making was a great alternative for me. I started by choosing my supporters. I decided on different people who would help me with different parts of my life. My first supported decision-making plan only included my mom, dad, brother, my mentor, and my therapist. But as I have grown older, my plan has evolved, and I have added many other supporters to my team in different areas of my life. Because of supported decision-making, it lets me keep my rights. I can change my own plan as my needs and life changes over time. I am the one in control of my life, not a judge or a guardian. No offense to anyone that is out there that is one of those two things. In 2021, I was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, which is a very rare form of cancer. This was during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was already using supported decision-making in my life, so it gave me some comfort to know I would have support going through this new journey. However, COVID-19 visitor restrictions made using supported decision-making harder. We had to advocate with the hospitals to have my supporters with me at my appointments. My hope is that when the bill becomes law, hospitals will be required to respect supported decision-making as a way of accommodating people with disabilities. It will then be recognized as a right and a choice everywhere. Fighting cancer has been one of the hardest journeys of my life. I have been through a lot of hard journeys already. I am so thankful I was given the freedom to choose how I go about my treatments. Having been able to use supported decision-making during my cancer journey really saved my life and helped me make my own decisions while battling cancer. Excuse me, sorry. I would not be the person I am here today without supported decision-making. For example, when I was 16 months into chemotherapy and 2 weeks into radiation, I came home one day and my body and mind were just feeling horrible and hopeless. I ended up in my room crying and just really wanting to give up. I told my mom, I do not care what happens to me. I just want it to stop, even if the tumor causes me to die. My mom had to take some time to process all this herself, but when she came back into my room, she came back not as my mom, but as my support person. She said to me, Jonathan, I do not know what the answer to all this is, but if you could put your faith in me as your support person, I'm going to try my hardest to help you figure this out. From there, I gave my mom the okay to contact my medical team, and together they would all come up with a different plan for me to think about. After the meeting, I was able to talk to my supporters about the plan, get my questions answered, and then I agreed to move forward with it. The plan ultimately saved my life while also taking care of my mental health at the same time, thanks to supported decision-making. Supported decision-making truly makes me feel involved with my life. It provided me with choices about when and how I was going to receive my cancer treatments. Because of supported decision-making, I was able to let my body and voice guide me with the help of my supporters. I did not have many choices when it came to having cancer, but at least I was able to control when and how I got through it. Full guardianship would have been worse than death for me, because I would have lost my choice. If I was not able to pick my support people during my cancer treatments, I would just be a shell of myself now, if I even survived. I'm the type of person that needs to have full trust in the people that are in my life. If someone else picked those people for me, or not fully be able to be the person I am today, I need to make choices for my own life. If a guardian had forced me into treatments, I would have been severely depressed, damaged, and not the person I am here today. Supported decision-making offers more options in my life. Supported decision-making is not for everyone, but I'm glad that I had the choice to use it for myself. Everyone should have the right to choose the way they want to live, so they can live their best lives to the fullest. The more choices, the better is something I think we can all agree with. Thank you.
Jonathan, that was so moving. Thank you for sharing that. There's a lot of material in there that I'd like to follow up on and really go through with you. That was very, very powerful. Thank you. Nancy, I'm going to move it over to you. Can you introduce yourself and talk about your role supporting Jonathan in supported decision making?
Sure. So my name is Nancy Gardner, and I am one of Jonathan's support people, and I am also his mom. Two separate roles. Jonathan picked me as his safe person, and I kind of cover a lot of his other areas. He tends to go to me for a lot of different advice and whatnot. So I feel privileged that he picked me as a support person, and I also get to be his mom too. So it's icing on the cake.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Morgan, may I send it over to you? Jonathan really defines supported decision-making in many ways. Is there anything you can add to his definition of supported decision-making?
I think, Jonathan, you define supported decision-making really well. When people ask me to define supported decision-making, I always think they're trying to look for some kind of legalistic definition. And in 2012, Professor Robert Dinerstein, he's a preeminent scholar in this field and works at American University's Washington College of Law, offered what's become a really popular definition of supported decision-making, and it's cited in a lot of U.S. publications. He defines supported decision-making as a series of relationships, practices, arrangements, and agreements of more or less formality and intensity designed to assist an individual with a disability to make and communicate to others decisions about the individual's life. And I think that's a great legalized definition. But let's talk about it really practically. From a real practical perspective, it's really something all of us, whether or not we're older or have a disability, use every day when we make decisions. As Jonathan said, we ask our friends or family members or professionals to help translate unfamiliar words or concepts. We ask them for advice and we make decisions. And I think when we do that, we're considered to be wise people, right? That's how you should be making decisions. But when people with disabilities and older adults need some help making decisions, I've seen them frequently seen by others as not being able to make any decisions at all, or someone else has to make the decisions for them. So while I would say supported decision-making really is human decision-making, I think we give it a special name when it's used by people with disabilities and older adults to kind of remind ourselves that they too have the right to ask for help and still make their own decisions. Now, the help they may need may be look different or be more than what other people may need. But we just start from a place of presuming they can make their own decisions, that they can choose what help they may want and what that looks like, and make their own decisions with the support they need and want. So that's really what supported decision making is. I still like Jonathan's definition better, but that would be what I would add.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jonathan, let's go back to you if that's okay. We understand from what you just said that there was some talk about guardianship. Can you talk a little bit about what was said about guardianship and why you decided that wasn't the right way for you?
Yes. So when guardianship was first brought up to that, me and my mom thought it was mostly the default option, and we were going to try to find an alternative or something that would work better. When we started off with that, my mom basically started off by asking the school what they would, if there's any alternatives. They said, he's on medication. He should just be on full guardianship. This clearly didn't feel right for us. But from there, my mom found out about support decision-making through a thing that, what's this, a workshop? It was a workshop that one of our close friends now gave. From there, she brought my father to one of those workshops that then both of them were on board with the idea. So when they decided to bring it to me, I was a little bit hesitant. I'll admit, I was a little bit hesitant about it because still not knowing. But as my mom explained to me that it was basically the exact same thing that we are doing at that moment, I said, okay, sounds legit. And that's how we got with supported decision making.
That's great. That's wonderful. You've already answered some of these questions already, and I am just going to follow up a little bit. Why did you feel at the time you were hesitant? Why did you feel as though supported decision making was a better option for you than guardianship was?
Because I would have lost my choice as a human being. Like, I wouldn't have much control over my life. Like, say, for example, my parents would have it, and I love them, but I would want to control over my life the most. But here's a little non-known fact that we didn't even know at the time, which we would have found out horrifyingly if we decided to go guardianship. Guardianship doesn't give you 100% guarantee that parents or basically someone that you would trust, aka me, would pick a guardian. It would be decided on courts and stuff like that for, like I said in my speech. So for that, for the stuff that I've been through, and let's just say, for a long story short thing, I have extreme trust issues. But, one sec, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought.
Okay. So that's where your support person comes in. So, I can read when he needs support. And so he's trying to express that what happens is you're not guaranteed as a parent that you're going to be named guardian. So you go to court and it is the judge in the court that decides that. And for Jonathan, he needed to be able to pick his own people because like he just said, he has a lot of trust issues and he would not do well with someone unknown to him that he did not trust fully to
make the big decisions for myself. Say, for example, my cancer journey.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be able to fully trust that person because one, let's say it's not my mom, I wouldn't know who they are and they're like making big decisions for me and I'm just like, what? And two, just honestly, like if you want a good example, just imagine if you're in that scenario and all that stuff. Like imagine if you're on a possible deathbed and some random person you've never met in your entire life is making these big decisions for you when you have no control over that. That is some of the scariest things I could ever imagine in my entire life.
So Jonathan, when you started with supported decision making, can you talk about how you learned about it and what the first couple steps were about becoming a decision maker for your own life?
Yes. So after we learned about it, after my mom talked to me, basically showed me that it was basically what we were doing, by that point, it came time to pick the supporters and who I would, feel supported by. So I just went with the people that I felt close to at the time. Basically my mom, dad, brother, and my therapist and my mentor at the time. Excuse me. But from there, as time grew along, I got some more, I got more people that I trusted from that. So I asked if they'd be interested in joining the team. So that way I could just basically, I guess, what's the word for it? I can't think I had something to say.
My like an light accident, I'm sorry.
Well, good thing you did that because you got me back in my train of thought, actually. So from there, due to a lot of trust issues, I would want to gradually build trust over time. Like, for example, there's my current mentor, who is not the mentor that I originally picked for my team. Over time, grew my trust, and I added him to my support team. I asked him, and he says, like, yeah, sure, why not? And from there, more people would be asked from who I would trust. And they say, it's not a big deal. It's just like, hey, it's just not a big thing. I've had people leave. I've had people come on, all that stuff before. And it's just about trust and who I trust at the time or the moment that I feel mostly comfortable with to say, hey, I trust you. I'd be honored if you would join on my team.
Do you do anything to train them, or how do you, when they join your team, what do you do to welcome them onto the team? Is there something that they have to know? Is there something that they have to do for you? Do they sign something for you? How does it work?
All they have to do is basically say, hey, Jonathan, if you need something, just call me and, we can talk it out, basically. It's basically as simple as that. There's no huge, party. There's no huge contract. There's nothing like that. They can leave and go as much as they want, or as much as the person allows, or whatever, really. But at the end of the day, I like to think of support decision-making like a company, a nonprofit company that no one gets paid off of, but nonetheless. I'm the CEO, and people come to me with ideas. Say, for example, my mom comes up to me with an idea and I say, no, I don't know about that. We just throw it out and move on to the next thing. Or maybe I have an idea and I say, okay, let's go with that. And they would have to support me in it, and all that stuff. And sure, it might be a bad idea. Let's just say I wanted to, I don't know, buy a big TV for some reason. Since that's on my brain right now. I don't know. I'm not interested in buying a new TV, but that's a different story. But let's just say that. And, it was a horrible purchase. My parents, or whoever's there at the time, or whoever I would call for that, would just support me through it and help me navigate it. But it would ultimately come down to my decision at the end of the day. say, for example, making big purchases and anything like that. It all comes down to the CEO. Does that make sense?
That's a really great explanation. Thank you for that. Morgan, so is this the typical process? Have you seen things done differently?
There's many different ways to use supported decision-making. I think frequently people look for some kind of checklist of some kind, and there's some useful guides on the Center for Public Representation Supported Decision-Making website. But I really liked how Jonathan was describing supported decision-making arrangements as changing over time, because I think sometimes people think they're these kind of static things that never change, and people's lives change. So of course, supported decision-making arrangements change over time. Supported decision-making also looks really different for different people. I think Jonathan is an example of a young man who has really robust family connections, and that's how it kind of started, along with some mentors. I've worked with people who don't have those, who pick supporters that are part of a more professionalized network, or people from their church, or, neighbors or friends. So there's many different ways to choose your supporter. And there's also many different ways to use supported decision-making informally and formally. A lot of people focus on supported decision-making arrangements, and that are agreements that are written down. That can be helpful, but a lot more people use it informally, like you or I. And I think that's another thing to think about when you're choosing supporters. When you ask that question about training, do you train them? There's not some kind of, I really liked how Jonathan answered that, because it's not like you have to go through some kind of formal training process to become a supporter. There are some best practices that I think we're going to talk about later. But the biggest part of it is really Jonathan trusting the person, right? Enough to serve as a supporter. And I think educating supporters about what their role is and what their role isn't.
Jonathan talked about the challenges in getting the hospital to recognize his supporters. I wonder, Morgan, you had mentioned more formalized agreements. Do those make it easier for hospitals and other players to recognize the supporters, or does that not really play much of a role?
I think there are advantages with what I call third-party enforceability, meaning people recognizing your supported decision-making arrangement by putting things on paper. I'm a lawyer. I like paper. And I believe, Jonathan and Nancy, you had something written down that was useful for you in enforcing the supported decision-making in the hospital. And that's really the advantage of having it. Some people use kind of supported decision-making agreements. Some laws have even passed into states creating certain kinds of forms and what they look like. But one of the things Jonathan also really mentioned is supported decision-making is an accommodation for someone's disability under the American with Disabilities Act. And that's another way of enforcing it, even if you don't have it on paper. Because decision-making is a major life activity impacting people's lives that you should be able to be accommodated for. Another thing that's also useful in creating kind of greasing the wheels for hospitals to recognize supported decision-making is to get over what I call the HIPAA hump, which is basically, HIPAA can be used, HIPAA, which is a health privacy law that's federal, can be used as kind of a weapon against supported decision-making. I can't talk to you, mom, says the doctor, because your child is over 18 and it's because of HIPAA. But that's really easily overcome by a simple release of information form called a HIPAA form that all the hospitals have, that can de-weaponize that and allow information to flow to supporters that would otherwise be confidential, so that they can advise the person and the person can make their own kind of healthcare decision. So there are many different ways of getting over that kind of enforceability hump.
Thank you.
Just to tag what Morgan said, when Jonathan got sick, we were practicing supported decision-making before Jonathan got sick. Then Jonathan got sick, and I was like, wow, we really should fill out those forms. So I went on to CPR and I did download those forms, and I did have them now concrete, in writing, notarized, and ready to go. The picking of the support people for those were already done because we knew who they were. And we did have everyone sign off along with a healthcare proxy, which also is really important, I feel, to accompany that, especially during the height of COVID. It was very important that we had all those documents just to, because going in, the doctor had no idea what supported decision-making was, and that Jonathan wasn't going to sit and be there for his appointment to hear what the procedures were going to be. That's not how we work things. So
yeah, we made a plan before going in and all that stuff. And here's the thing. I love my doctors now. I just want to make this clear before I tell the story. I love my doctors. They are some of the greatest people I've ever met in my entire life, and they are in full support of this. But at the beginning, there was nervous because, HIPAA. But the doctors took a huge leap of faith with me and said, this is the only way this kid's probably going to get the information in him, and they decided to go with it. And I'm eternally grateful for them taking that leap, honestly, because it helps so much. And I just wanted to tell that little story since my mom kind of added to it, to add a little bit of subtext to it. So
they thought, how are we going to, their goal was to treat Jonathan. My goal was how are we going to best do it. And we came together and did it.
Yep.
So.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful success story. That's great.
And I just want to say, Jonathan, you weren't alone in having to fight for your rights to get the kind of accommodations you needed during COVID and the really strict hospital bans. Supporters sometimes weren't allowed, right, to be even with the person. But accommodation for someone's disability is to have that kind of support if that's what's going to get you equal access to healthcare. And there were actually some federal complaints that were filed with the Office of Civil Rights on the federal level to really say, no, you need to allow people to get that kind of in-person support if they need it because of their disability. So you're really, in many ways a groundbreaker in that you were able to do that without filing some legal action. You were able to have doctors who understood that's what you really needed to get the kind of health care you deserve.
So I will say, I did have to say, just to get through the door from the lobby with my husband and I and Jonathan during the height of COVID, I did have to say, I do have my lawyer on speed dial that will let you know all about this. And they said, oh, no, they'll still commit to us. So, but I felt privileged that I knew someone that I could call, unfortunately. And that's why one of the reasons it's so important that this bill becomes law, because as a parent, when your child is sick, especially something like cancer or something like that, you do not need to have that, oh my gosh, how am I going to now get in there to support him when everybody needs support? I wouldn't have wanted to go in there myself. I would have somehow gotten both Jonathan and my husband and my other son in there to help support me.
So I know when you talk about the bill, you're talking about you all live in Massachusetts, and right now Massachusetts legislation is being considered that would create supported or formally recognized supported decision-making agreements. And, so I know that we have some other people from different places. I think I saw Texas, and Texas has had supported decision-making agreement legislation on the books since 2000. It was the very first to get that done. So it's almost, a decade, I guess. And so I do think, that can help with enforceability. And so we are seeing more states look to try to add that kind of state level enforceability for the very reason you're describing.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
I have a question for all of you now, so I'll start with Jonathan. What makes a good supporter?
For me, they have to have a couple of qualities. Trust, knowing they would, knowing that I could trust them with my life, and I guess trust. Really, at the end of the day, it's about trust for me.
Yeah.
About trust if I think they are good people at heart, and I know for a right they would be hey, that he's in trouble, I need to go help him out for this, basically. If I could feel like I could drop everything to go help them, and they could feel like they could go drop everything to help me, basically that yin-yang, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. That's very powerful. Thank you.
And
Nancy.
for me, someone that would make a good support person would be someone that Jonathan picks for himself.
Great. Thank you. Morgan, do you have anything to add there?
I think trust and picking this a person picking their supporters themselves are really important. I think we have to remember supported decision making is not something you impose on people. I don't pick I get to pick my supporters. So does Jonathan get to pick who that supporter is and who he doesn't want as a supporter. I think another really big one, I think there are a lot of components to being a good supporter. And, over the years, I've had to remind many people, including myself, of these and what they practically mean. But, supporters don't make decisions for the person. They have an obligation to advise the person, but it's the person that is the decision maker, not the supporter. So if I've given a supported decision making training and then a mother in the back raises their hand and says, I'm the supported decision maker for my adult son, I know I haven't done my job, because supporters don't make decisions for the person. They support the person in making their own decisions. I say trust is the most important piece of it, and it's mutual respect. It'd be the supporter being trusted by the person, and respecting the person, and vice versa. The supporters need to understand what they're providing support with, and in the way that the person who's the decision maker wants. So it's not about the supporter deciding how to support someone. It's that conversation that needs to happen to know what's the limit of what the person might want support with. So I know some people who say, I would trust my mom to support me with healthcare decisions, but I'm not going to talk to her about my boyfriend. And I'm going to rely on someone else for that. And so knowing what the limits of the kind of support the person is wanting is really important. And working together to figure that out, to also manage expectations. Because I've had people who have said, I want this person to be my supporter in every decision I make. And the supporter says, whoa, I can maybe help you with healthcare decisions, but I know nothing about financial decisions. You're really going to need to have some support. So you have to manage expectations, too, as a supporter. And then the supporter has to want the person to make their own decisions. They have to view that as, not trying to replace the person's decisions, not trying to pressure them into making a certain kind of decision. They have to guard in themselves about, am I pushing too hard? Am I doing undue influence? I think that's something that a lot of people, we hear a lot in the supported decision-making world and what that means. I think that's some other kind of important things for supporters to keep in mind.
Thank you. All right. This is another question for everybody. So I asked if there was training, Jonathan. If you were to create training, if you had the opportunity to tell people what they needed to know, what would that include?
I guess if there was training, I would just tell them, here are the key things you need to know. I need to trust you, and I need to respect you. Simple as that. I don't really have much else to add to it, but kind of goes into the previous question if you ask me.
Yep. Okay.
In, as far as me, training I feel like supported decision making is so individual for everyone. So I know supported decision making in Jonathan's life. So I can speak about training on his kind of team, but for his team, he's the decision maker. So I think and I don't want to speak for you, honey, but I think Jonathan picks people that he feels are already ready to help support him in these areas that need no training. He doesn't expect people to be perfect. He expects, I've made mistakes as a support person.
Plenty of times.
and that's okay. It's like he said, that mutual respect. And
for me, if I may jump in, it's honestly again, this is only for me. There's plenty of different people, there's plenty of different disabilities and all that stuff for this stuff. But when it comes to support decision making, it's all about who I trust with this, who would I trust with that, and this, that, and the other thing.
I think I got a good example.
Please do.
Yeah. So a good example is Jonathan has as one of his support people, his therapist, who she encompasses his mental health therapy, where he goes and, all these things. But she's also, so she's his therapist, but she's also, he asked her years ago to be his support person for his therapies. So things will come up, especially when he was sick. There was a lot of mental health issues that we all had to work through, me as well. And So I would see him struggling and I would say to him, Jonathan, do you think you'd feel better talking to Mrs. Clifford? Because I don't have all the answers of the world. And the fact that he knows I don't takes a weight off my shoulders. But, and he then decided, yeah, Mom, I think that I would feel better talking to Mrs. Clifford about this because it's just a different perspective. And at the end of the day, I'm playing two roles and she kind of is playing two roles too. But she also, I guess, throughout the years, we've all, accustomed ourselves to what role we need to be in for him at that moment. But, we called her and he was able to discuss what he was going through with her. I don't know if that answered. So, there was no per se training because he hit that person.
If I can, basically,
I think that's a good point, though. I think it's a really good point what you're saying. There's no formal training. It was about getting to know and knowing what you wanted, Jonathan, and how best to do that, knowing you as a person. And I emphasize that too. I don't think that this is not like some training program you have to go through before you can be a supporter. Now, if someone said, I want you to go through a training program before you become my supporter, that's something different. But it really is I would say it's in the real space of the person, in this case, Jonathan. There are some resources out there for supporters. I just wanted to, I wanted to kind of highlight those. So, there's some good tips and videos and graphics in a Georgia project. That is the first, one that I put into the chat, I Decide Georgia. And then there's also a much more lengthy best practice guide for some of those kind of where are the code of ethics of supporters? What should supporters be thinking about? That's out of the Center of Excellence on Supported Decision Making in Minnesota and Wisconsin by Volunteers of America. And so that's in the chat too. So it just gives you some ideas about how to check yourself as a supporter to make sure that you're doing what a person wants. So go ahead, Jonathan.
Yes. Basically, if you want a guide for how we see it, I think I can sum this all up in one with low info, but pretty much if you want to know what training is, it's pretty much before I even ask you to become a supporter. Sure, a lot of people are just always in flux if you want to put that in quotation marks for being a supporter. But at the end of the day, if I trust you enough and I know for a fact you're not gonna do anything to hurt me or betray me or anything like that, I'll ask you to be on the support team, basically like that. And I'll have a specific role thought of for you immediately.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. Morgan, can you tell us about the legal implications or powers associated with SDM?
Well, when I think about illegal perspectives with it, supported decision making, I've already talked a little bit about the implications of thinking about this as being linked to the American with Disabilities Act in terms of enforceability and as an accommodation for a disability, an individualized accommodation for someone's disability. So it can look different for different people. And that's been recognized in the 4th National Guardianship Summit as well. But if you really think about the powers of supported decision making, it's the powers held by the decision maker. So in the case of, Jonathan described how he decides who his supporters are, and that's going to change over time depending upon what he needs and what he wants. So supported decision making isn't giving the supporter any power to make the decisions over the person. In that way, the decision to enter into a supported decision making arrangement is a less complex or weighty kind of legal decision than to enter into a power of attorney with a proposed agent, because that powers of attorney give the agent power to act for and instead of a person, generally speaking, under certain circumstances, depending on what the document said. Supported decision-making arrangements don't do that. And I think that's part of why I just want to go back to what Nancy was saying about the importance of having that advanced planning package. So matching it with a healthcare proxy or power of attorney that would authorize planning for your future is also a really important piece in thinking about supported decision-making, regardless of your age or your disability, or if you're an older adult. So those are pieces I would say for legal implications of supported decision-making. I know that there was a question that said, is supported decision-making in Arizona? I say supported decision-making can be anywhere, in any state, without any change in law, because of the American with Disabilities Act.
Helpful. Thank you. All right. Jonathan, can you give us, we've certainly heard about some examples of how supporters have been involved in decisions that you've made. Do you have any other stories to tell about supported decision making, about how decisions get made and what it looks like for you?
Yes, I have plenty of stories to say, but one always sticks to mind that I think is a perfect example of supported decision making. Right over there is something I bought for it that I always remember. I'm not going to point it out, but long story short, here's what happened. I was a little bit hesitant on buying it. I was like, this costs a little bit of much. But my mom and I talked it out a little bit. I was like, here's my pros, here's my cons, and all that stuff. We discussed each one. She didn't really give me a definitive answer, but I decided to go with it since it was something that would bring me joy. So I did. I bought it, and I look over there every single time and think to myself, man, that was a stupid purchase.
That's great. That's wonderful.
But I also, if I could share a story that one of my favorite stories is, it just happened, I think it was 2 weeks ago. So Jonathan has a support person, who is also on his finance support under, finances too. He goes after a lot of money management things. And over the years, he's known him for now, how long have you known Mr. Stickney? Years.
Since I was 13, at least.
Yeah. So, and it started with Jonathan used to bake a lot, and he would make pies, and Mr. Stickney found out about the pies and wanted one of Jonathan's pies. So it started with us driving to his house with a pie for like a business transaction. And Jonathan was 13 at the time, like you said, and Jonathan didn't want to meet him. He was very happy to make the pie. Didn't want to meet him, just wanted to handle the pie and get that money. And so this is how it started. And so we would roll down the window almost like a fast food delivery. Here we go. Change it, right? And he would hand us the money, and time went on, and then it changed. Okay, now we're having full conversations in the driveway, which changed to, hey, want to come over and chat even longer? And I always accompanied him because that's what Jonathan needed at the time, even before he was 18,
And she's my chauffeur.
And I'm his chauffeur. And so this went on for years and years and years. Never did they hang out by themselves or anything like that. And it developed into, it was a few years ago, he was like, hey, you want me to add friendship to that finance thing? And it was like, Mr. Stickney was honored, like completely honored. So then about a month ago, he says to Jonathan, hey, want to, no, go right ahead.
He said, hey, I was looking for the opportunity, but, hey, do you want to go see that new Mario movie that's coming out?
You sit a little closer to your microphone. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. He said, don't mind being up close and personal, but he said, hey, you want to go see that new Mario movie? I'm like, yeah, I'll go see it with you. And from there, we started to make the plans for the first time, that it would just be me and him. So, when the time came, he came, picked me up, and we had a great time. We went to go see the Mario movie. He planned it all out. It was just a great day overall. And it was just like really fun just to see and go out with them. Like, we definitely have to plan more on that front. So, yeah.
And he had said to me, Nancy, do you want to join us? And I said, absolutely not. Because I think it just and he said to me after, he texted me later that afternoon, and he was just so delighted to spend the afternoon with Jonathan, because he says, I think if he could live with Jonathan, he would, because he says that Jonathan just makes him happy all the time. And he said it just brought him so much joy that he said, stayed the course with him and allowed Jonathan to kind of develop that friendship on Jonathan's terms. And look where it's landed. And he is and as a mom, not even as a support person, as a mom, that makes me feel so good because I always say, like, you know, one of a mom's worst fears, what's going to happen to your kids when you're gone, right? So I think that it speaks to Jonathan being the decision maker, making those choices of people he trusts to be his support people so that I know in my heart he's going to be, you know,
Just A-okay.
yeah, just A-okay. Thank you, buddy. You know, and it opens up your life a little bit more. I don't know, for the better.
What a wonderful example. I just want to say that, you know, one of the things we're going to be talking about is like best practices in supported decision making. And so leave it to Morgan to make this about identifying a best practice. But, you know, one of the things to, you know, think about is that, you know, that is expanding your supported decision making network from people that extend beyond your family. It's about connections to the community. You know, there have been studies that have shown people who have more varied natural supports in their lives, like, you know, friends, family that are in their lives are safer. You know, if we talk about the actual, what studies show. And the fact that kind of you're expanding your network and making those community connections. I love that story. I'm so glad you captured that story on this video, Heather, and that you shared it, Jonathan and Nancy. That was fabulous.
It's one of my favorites. Like I sat and I watched like television that afternoon. It was like, wow, I just couldn't think. I kept thinking they must be having a ball together. And it just made my heart so happy. Like, you know, just wonderful.
Yeah. Like, honestly, it was just a fun old time.
That's great. That's wonderful. Thank you. All right. Nancy, what is the biggest lesson you've learned as a supporter?
As a supporter, my biggest lesson is letting him be the guide. I don't know. Simple as that.
Okay. Thank you.
Letting him lead us.
Simple and clean.
Jonathan, how does it feel to have an SDM team?
It feels like I have a team behind me, figuratively, but I have like a bunch of supporters. Just I know that I can rely on to basically say, "Hey, we got you. We got your back. Like if you need anything, call us." And we know if we need anything, we can call you. Just to know the fact that I have that over the course of my life, like, is amazing, honestly. Like, it is something that I just never thought I would honestly have, to be honest. It's just a warm, comforting feeling.
That's wonderful. Nancy, I'm going to go back to you for a minute. What happens when Jonathan makes decisions that you don't agree with? How do you respond and how do you work with him?
So if Jonathan decides on something, and we've never really disagreed when Jonathan was sick, and I know he kind of briefly told about this story, and he said that to me. I'm going to back up. So when we were driving to Jonathan's first chemo appointment, my husband's driving, we're all in the car going, I got a phone call from his DDS person, and she said to me, "Listen, I'm going to help you out and we're going to pull full guardianship papers for you. So, you know, we'll get everything together. You just sign them. You're going to be all set, Nancy." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" Like, you know, and I was like, oh my God, I couldn't even wrap my head around it. I said, "Are you kidding me?" And he's sitting in the back seat and I'm like, oh my gosh, like we're all it was a very quiet ride into Boston because we're all in our own thoughts. And I'm like, I can't even talk to you about this right now. She's like, "You need to think, Nancy, what's he going to do when he doesn't want to do chemo anymore?" And I said, "Are you kidding me? What's he going to do? I'm going into his first appointment. I need to get through the day. I can't even think about this. I don't know what he's going to do, but that's something I need to talk to Jonathan about. And I do not want to have that conversation right now." Right? So I hung up on her, and it always stuck right here in my head through the whole entire cancer journey. And then we get to that lovely day that his dad brought him home from radiation, and we knew he was breaking. He was breaking bad, and it would just kind of the cup overflowing. And he was like, "That's it. I'm done. I'm not going back to the hospital. I'm not this. It was a very emotional day. No parent should ever have to have their kid say that to them, because I was extremely unprepared, even though it was right here. And I thought I had to leave the room because I was like, I had no words for Jonathan. And I left the room, and I hated leaving him alone at that time, but I had to fix this. That's all I could think of. I have to fix this for him. And I went into my husband's office, and all I could think of was what they said to me. And I thought to myself, what would be different? Let's say I was the guardian. What would be different at this moment? I still wouldn't have the answer, because Jonathan is Jonathan, and we are his parents and his support people. But because of our family dynamics and how we chose to live our life before cancer, during cancer, and now after cancer, it wouldn't have changed things. I would have still, and I thought about this. I honestly believe God gave me the strength to think about this moment, because I went back into him and I said to him, I'm okay, honey. It's all happy tears too, because you're okay. But I said to him, please put your faith in me. I have no answers, but I need you to get on. I'm going to contact your medical team. I need you to get on that camera and say, my mom needs to talk to you. I want nothing to do with this. Or whatever you need to say at the moment. That's what he happened to say. And we had an emergency team meeting. We came up with plans. They were already okay with speaking to just me about these things. But again, because of our journey, Jonathan needed to be involved. He is the decision maker. They gave me A, B, and C plans. I brought them back to him. He chose one. Thank God, because at the end of the day, it is his body. It is his mind. I have no right to say to him, keep going to treatment. And I think he says it so beautifully in his...
Can I
yes,
jump in
yes.
for a second? I will go into this shortly, because I don't want to take away from the sport decision-making thing, since this is a long story. But I feel like I need to mention this to get some clarity. When I was 8, it was 8, correct?
Yes.
When I was 8, I was not only physically abused by teachers, but mentally abused by teachers as well. That trauma has always stuck with me. So could you imagine the one person that I would trust would have strapped me down to that table and forced those chemo things into my blood? Could you imagine the relationship we would have had? Like, you see how we act like today, correct? That you see the dynamic, the jabs, the jokes, and everything we have together. You see that. But could you imagine how much distrust I would have had from my own mother, like for strapping me down for that stuff? Sure, I might have been alive, but sometimes there's worse fate. There's worse fates than death. I've learned that the hard way. And I've seen some stuff happen. I mean, it's sad. It's generally sad. But sometimes you need to face the hardest times to get the best results. You need to have those moments that say, hey, I'm done. And then in the worst times, the best solutions come out, which was to take a week off or two and just get your mental health back. And I am eternally grateful to my mom for taking the time to actually just say, you know what, this kid needs some time. He needs it, and everything. Like, I'm thankful for my doctors for agreeing to it. I'm thankful for them going at my own pace, because if I didn't have the support, if I didn't have support decision making, and I had a guardian that would have made this decision of strapping me down, I would have been a shell myself if I even survived. And I do mean that. You can take that however you want, but it's probably obvious what I mean. But at the end of the day, it's all about the support. And if I ever lost my choice, if I lost the one thing I could have hanged on to during my cancer journey, who would I be at the end of it? Who would I be? Would I be Jonathan Gardner? Would I still be the man I am before or after chemo that you see here today? But would I even be happy is the better question. would have I just been living the rest of my life miserably? And the answer to that would have been yes. I would have been living my life to misery because I would have lost every single trust I had for humanity. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you. That was beautiful and touching and very, we learned a lot from it. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for having us.
But I just also want to say, going back to the original question, but the support, when I disagree, if I disagree with Jonathan and he chooses to, I guess, go against that decision, I would pick him up when he needs to be, if it fell. Because he bought something that he's stuck with now, I'm there for him to vent to and for him to complain about how much money he lost during it, or, we always do pros and cons. I do it with my oldest son too. So, I would support him. I wouldn't berate him because, I make mistakes too. And I wouldn't want someone berating me. I would just want the support and be like, you know what? I always say to both my kids, we're all humans and we're supposed to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Let's turn it over to Morgan for a couple minutes. Morgan, obviously Jonathan is using supported decision-making really successfully. Are there some people that supported decision-making works better for than others? Are there some populations that tend to be more successful with supported decision-making?
I would argue that, you should always start from a place assuming anybody can use supported decision-making. I think a common myth about supported decision-making that I hear is that it can only be used by people with certain kinds of disabilities. So people who are as articulate as Jonathan is in his story and sharing his story. And it's not correct. A person's ability isn't determined by their IQ or their diagnosis. I've supported people using supported decision-making who've had intellectual disabilities and Down syndrome, who've had psychiatric disabilities, who don't use speech to communicate, who have memory loss or dementia. Now, what that supported decision-making looks different depending on the person. But we really, I think, should start from a place of assuming there's not only certain population can benefit from supported decision-making. His legal capacity really does operate along a continuum. It's not all or nothing. And it's important to kind of think that from that perspective. Supported decision-making, when we think about who would have what court, quote unquote, best for, I think it works for people who, have supporters they can turn to. And there are some people who don't. Who don't have those kinds of those supports, people who are willing to serve as their supporters, in that kind of way. And that's when supported decision making is harder, and requires more creativity. I also think supported decision making needs to be remembered that it can still be used for people who might have diminishing capacity, who might, we talk right now we're talking about kind of, and we frequently do this when we talk about people who might have developmental disabilities. We talk about as they grow over time, they build their capacities to be able to make decisions by learning from mistakes and having those kind of opportunities. When we talk about diminishing capacity, in other words, people who might have progressive dementia, where you might get to a point where you really aren't able to communicate in a way that people can understand you, there are still ways to be able to infuse supported decision-making in those people's lives as well. Dementia is getting diagnosed sooner and sooner these days. It comes down to advanced planning and thinking about really, you can introduce supported decision-making earlier on, and the supporters can get to know the person so well that when it gets to the point they have to do substitute decision-making through, for example, a power of attorney springing into effect because the person can no longer communicate those decisions, they'll know that person so well, they'll know really what substituted judgment they should be making for that person because they know them so well. And so, I do think we need to think about supported decision-making and starting from a place where anybody can use it and then thinking, how are we going to make this happen? So when I meet with someone and I think to myself, well, I don't know if they, I don't know if they can use supported decision-making, I say, okay, what am I doing wrong? first. I don't assume, I don't jump to a conclusion they can't use it. I say, okay, am I not communicating this clearly? How can I learn the person's needs more? How can they develop a kind of relationship with me that's a attorney-client relationship? And then springing from there. So those would be my advice on that particular topic.
So you talked about somebody with a progressive dementia who might not be able to use supported decision-making towards the end of the dementia. But let's talk about the opposite. Let's talk about somebody who has a guardian and may no longer need a guardian due to supported decision-making.
I love talking about that.
I love it too.
We talk about.
Tell me about that.
Because, it can mean the guardian did their job right. They basically helped the person be able to build their capacities to such an extent or to rely on other alternatives that don't involve court involvement. So, good job, guardian, in those kinds of situations. We can think about that too. I think we're seeing more and more reference to supported decision-making, making its ways into kind of judicial deliberations and orders like that to terminate guardianship or refuse to order guardianship. And we have those in at least 15 states now, as well as DC, that have those court orders. And many of them occurred without a change first being made in law. So it's possible, restoration of rights or termination of guardianship is a possibility, and supported decision-making can be used to end a guardianship. And I've represented people in doing that. I think a lot of the well-publicized cases around this area have really focused on people with developmental disabilities or who have had disabilities since birth. So I'm going to focus on a different example so that we can think more broadly about when terminations of guardianship in favor of supported decision-making can happen. So I represented the first older adult in DC and becoming the first DC resident to have her guardianship terminated. And I'm going to talk about that case a little bit. Okay. So in that particular case, her support network looked very different than Jonathan's. Okay. Like many older adults, it was becoming more professionalized over time. She had a more limited pool of really trusted family members. She had a mixture of service and community-based supporters in her life, like attorneys from local legal service organizations, case managers from aging service programs, or the AAA network, local church leadership. And that case really hinged on really bolstering that pre-existing network by connecting her to additional supports and services, because those can be also alternatives to guardianship, right? So connecting her to a local program that assists older adults with memory loss in budgeting and managing their finances. And it actually included a kind of step-up program where if her memory loss continued to decline and she continued to exhibit evidence of dementia and couldn't make those financial decisions herself, even with support, then it could go up to being a representative payee. So they're managing her Social Security benefits through another alternative to guardianship. And it was about convincing the court that these alternatives would work for her, and including supported decision-making, and also really incorporating in there advanced planning tools to plan for that future that we talked about if the memory loss got more and more significant, so that it really impacted her life further in her ability to make decisions. And, we were able to persuade the court that she didn't need to have the guardian anymore. And that's how we did it with supported decision-making. I would also highlight that sometimes guardianships come about because of a crisis, right? Like if we think about like professional guardianships, like in her case it did, she had gotten in arrears in her rent and she basically agreed to guardianship. So she consented to her own incapacity, which is its own kind of odd thing to me, because her landlord wouldn't let her do a repayment plan unless she did. So she was at risk of losing her home. And so she agreed to the guardianship. But she was, through careful planning with her automatic bill pays and other kinds of structures in terms of budgeting, that emergency or that crisis of her, not being able to pay her rent or being kicked out on the streets by, I will say, an unreasonable landlord that might have been being discriminatory to her. That was allayed. She was able to do some planning so that that would not happen again. And so her circumstances changed. And that in and of itself can be a way of showing how you can terminate a guardianship in favor of less restrictive options. You can think about that also like someone has some health emergency, or they haven't done advanced planning during a crisis and they're in no position to do it during that particular crisis, but later on they're able to do it. So thinking a little bit about that creatively, how we can use supported decision-making to extend it beyond the population people traditionally think are the ones who benefit from supported decision-making.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you again, Morgan, for one more question. So you mentioned earlier that supported decision-making can sometimes be used inside a guardianship. So that guardians can sometimes include supported decision-making in their work. Can you talk about what that might look like?
Absolutely. So, I just want to say, in its purest form, supported decision-making is an alternative to guardianship because a person's legal right to make their own decisions hasn't been legally removed in some way by a court. However, supported decision-making principles can and should be used within guardianship arrangements. It's a best practice recognized by the National Guardianship Association, which was one of the first organizations to formally recognize supported decision-making, not only as an alternative to guardianship, but also using it within guardianship, through its statement that it issued in was it 2016? But it was, one of the first to actually put it in writing and say, this is what we stand behind. And they'd had the best practices on engaging people in their decision-making when they're in guardianship arrangements for far longer than that. So, it can and should be used within that. It means guardians involving people in their own decision-making, not making decisions behind closed doors. It's about, really having that open line of communication and developing the trust with the person as a guardian. And it's about also recognizing when the guardianship may not be needed anymore and being supportive of limiting or terminating guardianship. One of the cases I was involved in for a man with developmental disabilities who was the first DTC resident to have a guardianship terminated period in favor of supported decision-making. His family, his guardians, and they supported him in building up skills like banking over time. They had gotten guardianship over him when he turned 18 because they were told he had to get it to get adult services. That's a lie. They were misinformed, but they wanted to support him in his dreams, and so they did it. And then they realized it wasn't right for them. But it's because they had worked with him for so long in developing those skills and in being able to act for himself that he became able to legally act for himself. So that's the kind of way in which supported decision-making principles can be used within guardianship.
That's great. Thank you. So I have a question for all of you here. Sometimes people say the good thing about guardianship is a judge is overlooking all of the decisions. The guardian has to submit reports to the court, whether it's financial reports or personal reports, so that, somebody's looking out and, it's keeping the person safe. Supported decision-making doesn't have the court oversight. Is there anything that makes you concerned that there isn't, that oversight from some other organization to keep the person safe?
Do you want to start with Jonathan and Nancy?
Sure. I guess for us, we okay. For us, I would probably say we don't really have like an organization looking over the supported decision-making thing. It's really like if I see something that's fishy, who's in charge of it? Well, me, obviously. I'm the CEO of this. But sorry. I just needed a little bit lighter after all that. I just said a while back. But, so here's how it basically would work. Like, if they came to me with an idea I didn't like, I would just say no to it, and that would be the end of it. They could keep trying with it, but it'd just be a no, and if it gets to the point where it gets annoying, I could just remove them. Simple as that. That's what I would say, honestly.
I think, so Jonathan is the one in charge. He's the judge and the jury here. So if there's someone on his team that he's like, you know what, I'm not feeling the love here or something, he can go to one of his other support people and say, ask for support. How do you think would be best to handle this? And he would be given that answer. And then he would decide on how to go about it, even if it required like me to help him talk to this person and to have them exit the team. And I think something that needs to be noted is, as Jonathan's support person, if Jonathan ever said to me, you know what, Mom, I think I got this. No offense, I could see him saying this, no offense, but can you just go back to being just Mom now no more support person. I'm going to go with A, B, and C here. And I'd be okay with that because I think, like Morgan said, the other person that went from guardianship to supported decision making, we've done our job. And to me, that's okay if he wants to do that. I know I need certain supports in my life. Those people can change over time. And that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be friends with them or love them or anything like that. It's just almost like the natural evolution of how things grow and things change. And almost like Jonathan's team, when it started, was very, very small, and it's evolved to be bigger now.
Yeah.
And that itself is a protection. The fact that it's grown is a safeguard. And more people are there to do checks and balances with each other. I get this question a lot about safety. And, any legal tool, be it guardianship, representative payees, powers of attorney, can be abused by bad actors. You only have to read the news to find that out, right? There have been guardianship abuses where the court oversight wasn't sufficient enough to protect somebody. Guardianship in and of itself doesn't protect you in that way. And I kind of looked at, I really like this thing that Alicia said in the chat here. Guardianship can also promote a false sense of security. It's a, quote, power of consent, not a power of compliance, unquote. There's no guarantee of safety ever, and it doesn't inherently reduce or remove vulnerability. And I could not agree with you more. You said it that was very articulate, and you said it very well. There's no studies that I'm aware of that say people under guardianship are automatically safer. Okay. And on the other hand, there are decades of studies that have shown that people with disabilities who are supported to have more control over their lives and exercise self-determination have better life outcomes. They're more independent, they're healthier, not just physically, but psychologically. They're more integrated in their communities, and they're better able to recognize and resist abuse because they're supported to be actors in their own lives. So that's what I would say about the safety question.
Thank you.
I just had a thought while this was going on. It's not a what if, but I feel like it's at least a part of the question as well. So let's just say, for example, someone did have a guardian. Okay. There's some possibilities with the safety concerns as well for that. Like, this just popped in my head, so don't mind it not being as articulate as it probably should have been. But let's just say, I don't know, let's say the judge and the guardian just wanted to get money out of this person. Just they had a deal behind the scenes. That could easily be something, like, to be like, hey, that's a little bit fishy. Like, that is something like that just popped in my head. It's not much, but it was just a what if. I thought it was valid.
It's a good point. It's a good point. We have seen well-publicized cases where people under guardianship are abused, And I think, in terms of that false sense of security, I think sometimes families think, well, if I'm the guardian, I'll have control over things. The truth of the matter is, you're not chained to the person, there can be bad actors in that person's life and that you can't stop that abuse from happening. It's not you can't, people sometimes think, I'm worried about police violence. Unfortunately, being a guardian over someone doesn't stop from police violence. You actually have to be thinking about a safety plan, right, to influence. So, I think it's a good question to ask about safety, but I think we have to realize that we need to think of different safeguards when we think about real and true people's safety. And that's connecting them to the community and letting them have control over their own lives.
Yes.
Yeah. Morgan, I talked a little bit about a supported decision-making agreement earlier. When there are agreements, are there things that you would suggest that people include, or even informally, things that people should include when they're discussing their supported decision-making framework?
So, once again, I emphasize you don't need to have an agreement to do this. I think that but if you do put something in writing, I think it's about really letting the person be in charge of who they're picking. It's about deciding what kind of control they have over their own lives and what kind of support that they want and what that support looks like. And that's something you want to include too. I think you would also want to include, what you see in some supported decision-making agreement legislation is you see some kind of, I call it an indemnification clause to say, like, someone reasonably relying on this agreement is not going to, be faulted for that. If they reasonably rely on it, that gives it the enforceability. That's where state legislation can really help, because it kind of includes that kind of indemnification kind of clause in there. The other thing I would say that you should be including in that is a growth clause, which basically is a clause that kind of says, we're periodically going to review this as a team to make sure that, if you're going to put it in writing, don't make it seem static. Think every 2 years. I think you should have that in powers of attorney documents too. We'll consider reviewing this every 2 years to see, because the supporters might change over time. And I think those are other important pieces. I think when we talk about formalization, it's really important to know your state law, because some states have supported decision-making agreement legislation that requires you to use a certain form or have certain elements, and they vary by state. So I think that's another really important thing if you're thinking about formalizing. As I step back and I say, I often ask, which states have supported decision-making. We're seeing more states legislate supported decision-making in a lot of different ways. Some are through agreements. Some are through recognizing it as a reasonable accommodation in the medical context. Others are about special education. So it can look really different depending on the state. 41 states in D.C. have introduced one or more pieces of legislation on supported decision-making, and 32 have passed them, including D.C. So really, it's spreading, the legislation here, piece of it. And you really need to know what your state's law is, because it can vary. It's why there's some appeal to thinking about supported decision-making as a reasonable accommodation, because that goes across state lines, right? When you think about supported decision-making arrangements. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Okay, we're winding up, and I don't want to take all of the time myself. Just let's talk about best practices. Are there any best practices that any of you want to share, that we can let the audience know about? Any best practices in supported decision making that you could share with us?
Can I share first, and then I'll flip it over to you guys?
Sure.
One of the things I really want, I think we've shared a lot of best practices in here by talking. I would say, with supported decision making, trying to encourage the more and more supporters being part of the team, I think, is one of the strongest safeguards for supported decision making, because they act as checks and balances for that, So thinking about building out networks, and that includes for people under guardianship, building out their community networks is really key if you're actually trying to promote people living and living healthy and happy lives. So that, I think that's one of the best practices that, I think we have decades of study that support. And so I would really encourage people to think about that. When someone relies on one person for everything, they're actually very vulnerable. And that's includes that is one supporter or one guardian or one agent. It makes them very isolated. And so really thinking about how to increase that number, I think, is key.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Jonathan and Nancy?
Yeah, really what Morgan said really is what I would say, honestly, for this. And I think my mom would also agree with that.
Definitely. The more, and again, you have to go at the person's pace. Like, when he began, he didn't have a huge community, and now he does. And it makes me think back to a story. My oldest son was over here, who's one of Jonathan's support people, and they were just chit-chatting in the other room. I was sitting in the kitchen, and I heard Eric say to him, we need to have a conversation. And I think I know the answer to this, Jonathan, but I'm going to ask you anyways. And he said to Jonathan, where do you want to live when mom and dad die? And I'm like, oh my gosh, where is this coming from? Right? So, and Jonathan says to him, no offense, Eric, but I don't want to live with you. And Eric said, well, I kind of thought that. And I'm thinking to myself, whoa, that's not my vision. My vision was, and we always just all assumed in this house that God forbid something happens, that Eric will take care of Jonathan, and he lives on his own, and, we'll take him in. And shame on me, because
you went through every single possible thing except for my.
I never, we just assumed this is what will happen. The boys will take care of each other. And so from the conversation, it went on to, so now that I know that you don't want to live with me, what does it look like to you? Do you want to live down the street from me? Because I know you don't drive. And they went on and on. It was such a healthy conversation, but it also, again, gave me that peace as a mom. And as Jonathan's support person, and I am doing something right and we're going the right direction, that they would take care of each other no matter what it looked like. And still listening to Jonathan's voice for that, which is important. So I guess the best practice is really just let the decision maker make those decisions, you know?
Yeah, like literally let the guide be the guide.
I love that story because it really talks about healthy conversations and hard conversations, really hard conversations, and probably as a mom, really hard ones to hear. But
again, we practice all this stuff all our lives. We've been very open and this has just been the shoes we've been walking in. It wasn't like, oh my God, he's sick. Let me find out what I can do now, you know?
Or it wasn't like, I was sick, let's go sign these papers to bother the doctors. It was more like, we're sick, we need these to feel safe and feel like we have some sort of control.
And I remember thinking to myself, he was sick, and now we're really going to see how this all works in real life.
Yeah.
Almost. Put it to the test.
We did, and it's ultimately saved my life. We'll take care of a kid.
That's wonderful. I'm going to open it up to questions, but I want to just let you know in the back of your minds, if there are any last thoughts that we haven't covered, I will give you that opportunity just in a couple of minutes. So Leah, I know you've been kind of keeping an eye on the chat. Is there anything any questions that came up in the chat so far?
One question I saw was, do you have a redacted order or sample template order that you'd be willing to provide on terminating guardianship because of supported decision making? I'm in a state that does not currently have laws on supported decision making. And I said, there are some templates that are out there that I'm happy to share, but I wanted to know what state you live in. So if you're still on, if you could please put that in the chat, that would be great.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And for anybody who is going to the National Guardianship Association's colloquium, one of the speakers is specifically speaking. She's an attorney speaking on orders that can be created to terminate guardianships when supported decision making is an option. So that's going to be an exciting. We have a question here. My question is for Jonathan. Have you spoken to any friends or other people with disabilities about terminating their guardianship and the options they have about supported decision making?
No, I have not talked to any friends about supported decision making in that terms, about terminating any type of guardianship, because to my knowledge, I don't know if they do have a guardianship or not, to be honest. But I've definitely talked to them about supported decision making once or twice. But it was mostly in passing and more like, hey, what have you been up to? I've been advocating for this bill. And
but Jonathan does sit on the Massachusetts Coalition for
supported
decision making in Massachusetts. So he does talk about it a lot and shares, but his friends necessarily don't have guardians or use supported decision making. So that kind of,
and some of them not even disabled.
Yeah. So it doesn't, but he does try to share his voice to help others make that decision for how to live their best life.
Yeah. Like if they were to come to me and ask, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about supported decision making? I'd be more than happy to go on and on about it. Because honestly, I love this thing and I would love more people to know about it.
That's wonderful. Jonathan is a real advocate. For those of you who don't know, he's the co-chair of the Supported Decision Making Coalition, trying to get legislation in Massachusetts enacted. So he is definitely very active on the political scene on this issue as well. So that's wonderful.
Heather, I see some people interested about supported decision making in their states. And so I'm going to put in the chat, the National Resource Center for Supported Decision Making's website. I'm the former project director of there. And they have a in your state section that you can click on and see, there's some redacted orders that are on there. If you check out DC, for example, you'll see a redacted order terminating guardianship in favor of supported decision making. And you'll also see introduced legislation and enacted legislation on supported decision making on those. So